At my late wife us will reading, my arrogant son-in-law leaned back in his leather chair and called me a useless old man to my face. I stayed completely silent. I took the insult because I knew exactly why my wife had hidden one final secret clause in her legal documents. When the lawyer finally broke the seal and read her last words out loud, that smug smile on my son-in-law's face vanished forever. If you want to know how a retired rail yard worker derailed a greedy millionaire, keep listening. My name is Roland. I am 68 years old, and for 35 years I managed the absolute chaos of Atlanta, U.S. busiest rail yards. If you have never stood in a rail yard at 3 in the morning, you truly cannot understand the kind of immense pressure that sits on your shoulders. I was responsible for routing hundreds of massive freight trains, making sure thousands of tons of heavy steel moving at high speeds never collided. I learned how to stay calm when the emergency alarms were blaring. I know how to keep a 500-ton freight train from derailing. I know how to anticipate a devastating disaster before it even happens, and I know how to pull the right levers to prevent a total catastrophe. But I never in my wildest dreams expected the biggest train wreck of my life to happen right inside my own family. I loved my wife Beatrice with every single ounce of my soul. We were an unlikely pair back in the day, and plenty of folks had their cruel opinions about us. I was a hard-working black man whose hands were permanently stained with diesel grease and sweat. Beatrice was a sharp, brilliant white woman with a head full of big dreams and a heart made of pure gold. People talked and people stared, but we never cared about the outside noise. We only cared about each other and the future we wanted to build. When she came to me one evening and said she wanted to start her own boutique retail business, she did not have the capital. The banks looked at our address, they looked at my blue-collar job, and they laughed us right out of their polished offices. So I did what a man is supposed to do for his family. I took on every single night shift I could find. I worked double shifts back to back, breathing in thick, toxic exhaust fumes and freezing my hands to the bone in the dead of winter, just to save up enough cash to rent her first little storefront. I would finish a brutal 14-hour shift at the train yard and go straight to her new empty shop to paint the walls and build the wooden display shelves with my own 2 hands. I believed in her magnificent vision, and she believed in my unyielding strength. Over the decades, that one little storefront grew into a highly successful chain of retail boutiques scattered across the entire state. Beatrice was the absolute brains of the operation. She had a genius mind for numbers and a natural grace that charmed every corporate supplier she ever met. I was the silent muscle that kept our foundation strong. I trusted her completely with every penny we ever made. I signed over the bank accounts, the property deeds, and the legal rights because she knew exactly how to make our money grow, and I knew my place was supporting her safely from behind the scenes. We built a beautiful, prosperous life together, and we raised a wonderful, gentle daughter named Sarah. I thought my golden years would be spent sitting on our back porch with Beatrice holding her hand and watching the Georgia sunset. But cancer does not care about your quiet retirement plans. It came fast, it was brutal, and it stole the love of my life away from me. It was a damp, overcast Tuesday when we lowered Beatrice into the ground. The Atlanta sky was heavy with dark gray clouds perfectly matching the crushing, suffocating weight inside my chest. The graveyard was terribly quiet except for the cold wind rustling through the old oak trees. I stood by the open grave wearing my best black suit, holding a single red rose. My heart was completely shattered into pieces. 35 years of unwavering devotion, of shared laughter and silent tears were gone in the blink of an eye. My daughter Sarah stood just a few feet away, weeping quietly into a small handkerchief. I desperately wanted to reach out and hold my little girl. I wanted to pull her into my arms and tell her that her daddy was here and that everything was going to be all right. But there was a thick, invisible wall standing between us. That wall was her husband, Preston. Let me tell you about Preston. He is a white real estate broker who wears custom-tailored suits that cost more than my first pickup truck. He drives a massive luxury SUV, and he carries himself like he owns the very ground we walk on. From the very first day Sarah brought him home to meet us, I knew something was fundamentally wrong with the man. He had this slick, arrogant smile and cold eyes that constantly scanned our home, calculating the price of our furniture and the exact value of our property. He looked down on me because I worked with my hands for a living. He thought my thick calluses and my worn-out work boots made me an inferior human being. What Sarah did not want to admit was that Preston hid his own crushing financial debts behind a flashy lifestyle and a fake facade of elite superiority. And worst of all, he was slowly suffocating my beautiful daughter. Sarah used to be so vibrant, so full of bright joy and ambition. But ever since she married Preston, she had become a nervous, shrinking shadow of herself. She was trapped in a toxic cycle of emotional abuse and strict financial control. He constantly monitored her spending. He isolated her from her childhood friends, and he always made sure to keep a bitter wedge between her and me. As the priest finished his final prayer, I stepped forward to toss my red rose onto the polished wood of the casket. The tears were burning my eyes, blurring my vision. I was saying my final earthly goodbye to the only woman who ever truly understood me. Suddenly, I felt a dark presence step right up beside me. I thought it might be Sarah finally coming to comfort her grieving father. But it was Preston. He leaned in so close I could feel his breath on my neck. I could smell his expensive designer cologne mixed with the faint sour scent of morning alcohol. I thought for a brief foolish second that he was going to offer a decent word of condolence, or maybe just stand there in respectful silence for his mother-in-law. Instead, he leaned his head toward my ear and smirked. "Start packing your bags, Roland." His voice was a cold, venomous whisper that sliced right through the quiet, solemn hum of the graveyard. "A useless old black man like you has no right to enjoy my mother-in-law's legacy. You are done here. The house is mine now." My blood instantly boiled. The sheer disrespect, the absolute pure audacity to stand over my wife's open grave and spit those racist, hateful words directly into my face. For 35 years, I hauled heavy steel and iron. My hands are thick and heavy with dense muscle. In that split second, every single instinct in my body screamed at me to grab him by his expensive silk tie and throw him right into the fresh dirt. I wanted to smash his smug face and show this arrogant punk exactly what a useless old man could do to him. My fists clenched so tight my knuckles ached and my old joints popped. The anger was a physical fire burning hot and violent in my gut. I took a sharp breath, ready to pivot and strike him down right there in the grass. But then I heard a small, heartbreaking sob. It was Sarah. She took a timid step toward me, reaching out her trembling hand. "Dad," she whispered, her voice cracking with profound grief. She just wanted to hug her father. She just wanted a single moment of safety and comfort on the absolute worst day of her life. Before I could even open my arms to receive my crying daughter, Preston turned his back on me and forcefully grabbed Sarah by the wrist. His grip was tight, cruel, and completely unapologetic. His fingers dug deeply into her fragile arm. "We are leaving," he snapped, yanking her backward. "Do not waste your time on him." He dragged her away from the graveside, pulling her roughly toward his shiny black SUV parked on the gravel path. Sarah stumbled in her heels, trying to keep up with his aggressive, furious strides. She looked back at me over her shoulder, and the sheer terror, The absolute helplessness in her tear-filled eyes shattered my soul all over again. He shoved her roughly into the passenger seat, slammed the heavy door shut, and sped off, spinning gravel into the damp air, leaving me standing completely alone in the cemetery. The rage inside me swelled into a massive tidal wave. I took a heavy step toward the retreating car, my jaw clenched so hard my teeth ground together. I wanted to chase him down. I wanted to rip the doors off that vehicle and drag him out into the street. But I stopped. I froze right there on the damp grass because a memory flashed in my mind, vivid and crystal clear. It was a memory from just 3 days ago in the sterile, quiet room of the hospice clinic. Beatrice was lying in the hospital bed, her breathing terribly shallow and weak. The medical monitors beeped a slow, steady rhythm of an ending life. She was holding my hand, squeezing it with the very last bit of strength she possessed. She pulled me close until I could feel her faint, warm breath on my cheek. Beatrice knew exactly what Preston was. She was a brilliant businesswoman, and nobody could hide their true wicked nature from her. She saw right through his flashy suits, his fake smiles, and his desperate, greedy ambition. Roland. She had whispered, her voice barely a rasp in the quiet room. Listen to me carefully. Preston is going to try to break you. He is going to try to take everything we built, and he will use Sarah as a weapon to do it. But you must promise me one thing, my love. Do not let your anger make you foolish. Do not use your fists to solve this. Let him think he has won. Let him get so arrogant and so blind that he trips over his own enormous ego. Let him dig his own grave, Roland. Promise me you will wait for the right moment. I had promised her. I kissed her feverish forehead and swore to God I would protect our family exactly the way she wanted. I promised I would use my mind and not my hands to destroy him. Standing there in this damp, quiet graveyard, watching Preston's car disappear down the winding road, I took a deep, long, trembling breath. I let the hot, violent fire in my chest cool down into something much more dangerous. I let it turn into absolute ice. Preston thought I was just an uneducated physical laborer. He thought I was a broken, grieving old man who would just roll over and surrender to his elite demands. He thought his expensive suits and his fancy vocabulary made him untouchable. He had no idea what kind of storm was waiting for him. I wiped the final tears from my eyes and turned my back on the open grave. I was done crying. It was time to go to work. The drive back from the cemetery was a long blur of gray skies and wiping cold rain from the windshield of my truck. I pulled into the driveway of the house Beatrice and I had built from the ground up all those years ago. Walking through the front door usually brought a wave of warmth, a smell of cinnamon, or the sound of her humming a soft tune from the kitchen. Today, the silence hit me like a physical blow to the chest. The air in the hallway felt heavy and stagnant. Every instinct in my 68-year-old body wanted to collapse onto the sofa, bury my face in my rough hands, and let the grief swallow me whole. I wanted to weep for the loss of my beautiful wife. I wanted to weep for the horrible way Preston had just dragged my daughter Sarah away from her mother's grave. But I did not shed another tear. I took off my dark suit jacket, draped it over the back of the dining room chair, and slowly rolled up the sleeves of my white shirt. Beatrice had not raised a weak man, and she certainly had not married one. I had a promise to keep. My mind went back to 4 nights ago in the quiet, sterile hospice room. Beatrice was fading fast by that point, the heavy doses of morphine making her drift in and out of consciousness for hours at a time. But there was a brief window around 2 in the morning when her eyes suddenly cleared. She had reached out and gripped my wrist with an intense, desperate strength that surprised me. She told me to go down to our basement the moment the dirt finally settled over her casket. She told me to find the old heavy oak workbench I had built for myself decades ago when we first bought the property. Look behind the wooden pegboard, Roland, she had whispered, her breathing terribly shallow and ragged. Where you hung your first rail yard lantern. Do not trust anyone in that family. Break the wall. I honestly thought it was the fever talking, but the sheer piercing clarity in her gaze told me she was entirely lucid. She was protecting us one last time, even as her own light was going out. I walked down the creaky wooden stairs to the basement. The familiar comforting scent of sawdust and old motor oil filled my lungs. This was always my personal sanctuary, the place I repaired broken things, the place I found quiet peace after a grueling 14-hour shift managing the loud, chaotic trains. I walked straight over to the heavy oak workbench sitting in the corner. Above it hung a large wooden pegboard covered in my old trusted tools. Right in the center, hanging from a rusted iron hook, was the heavy brass lantern I used during my very first year working on the railroad tracks. I took the brass lantern down and set it gently aside. I reached over and grabbed my heavy, solid steel crowbar from the tool rack. I did not hesitate for a single second. I swung the steel crowbar forward with all the strength in my shoulders and drove it straight through the drywall right behind where the lantern had been. The loud sound of cracking plaster echoed sharply in the empty basement. White dust puffed into the damp air, coating my dark, calloused hands. I swung the crowbar again and again, tearing away large, jagged chunks of the wall. I pulled the broken pieces of drywall back with my bare hands, completely ignoring the sharp edges scraping my skin. Hidden perfectly between the wooden studs of the house was a sleek, matte, black metal box. It was a high-security biometric safe. Beatrice had always been a highly cautious businesswoman, but this level of extreme secrecy was something entirely different. There was a small glass fingerprint scanner on the front, glowing with a faint blue light in the shadows. She had always told me my thumbprint was registered on everything she owned, just in case of a sudden emergency. I pressed my thumb against the cool, glowing glass. The machine beeped a soft, quick chime, and the heavy metal door clicked open. My heart pounded a heavy, frantic rhythm against my ribs. I reached inside the dark compartment and pulled out a thick, heavy leather dossier and a small silver USB drive. I carried them over to my workbench, turned on the bright overhead shop light, and sat down heavily on my wooden stool. I took a deep breath, brushing the white drywall dust off the dark leather cover. I flipped the folder open. The very first pages were official bank statements from Beatrice U.S. corporate retail accounts. I knew my wife's U.S. business was highly profitable. She had built a magnificent retail empire across Georgia through sheer brilliance and unyielding determination. But the numbers I was looking at made my stomach churn with instant nausea. Massive sums of money had been methodically transferred out of her primary operating accounts over the past 24 months. $50,000 here, $80,000 there. The money was being funneled into a series of unfamiliar holding companies and suspicious offshore accounts. I plugged the silver USB drive into my old laptop sitting on the corner of the bench. The digital files on the drive were impeccably organized by Beatrice herself. She had been quietly tracking every single stolen penny while she was physically fighting a terminal illness. I opened a digital folder labeled with Preston U.S. name. The screen illuminated a staggering, terrifying web of financial deceit. Preston had abused his trusted position as her real estate broker and personal financial consultant. He had forged commercial invoices for ghost properties, inflated construction costs on her new boutique locations, and pocketed the massive differences for himself. He was bleeding my wife's U.S. life work completely dry. He had stolen well over $1 million while smiling warmly in our faces and eating hot meals at our family dinner table. Preston was not just a flashy, arrogant jerk with a loud mouth and expensive tailored suits. He was a cold-blooded, highly calculated thief. He had watched Beatrice grow weaker and weaker from the harsh chemotherapy and used her declining physical health as a convenient cover to systematically drain the wealth we had sacrificed our entire youth to build. He was siphoning her grand legacy to pay off his own disastrous private investments and fund his elite country club lifestyle, all while my sweet daughter Sarah lived in a state of constant emotional terror. I sat there staring at the screen, reading email after email, where Preston instructed shady contractors to double bill the estate. He had been so incredibly arrogant, so sure of his own superior intelligence, that he left a digital paper trail a mile long. But Beatrice had found it. Even sick and dying, my brilliant wife was 10 steps ahead of him. She had compiled a bulletproof case against him, but she ran out of time to pull the trigger herself. She left the weapon fully loaded for me to fire. My vision blurred with absolute blinding fury as I realized the depths of his betrayal. I flipped to the very back of the thick leather dossier. There was a separate manila envelope tucked tightly behind a clear plastic flap. I opened it and pulled out a stack of heavy legal documents stamped with official state seals. As my eyes scanned the bold black text at the very top of the page, the blood in my veins ran entirely cold. It was a durable power of attorney and a comprehensive medical proxy. The signature at the bottom of the page supposedly belonged to me. But I had never seen this piece of paper in my entire life. The signature was a flawless, masterful forgery. I read the dense legal jargon, and the terrifying reality of Preston U.S. ultimate master plan crystallized in my mind. The document cited a fabricated medical diagnosis from a private shady physician clearly on Preston U.S. payroll. It claimed that I was suffering from severe advanced grief-induced dementia. It stated that my mental faculties were rapidly deteriorating, making me a danger to myself and completely incapable of managing my own daily affairs or my wife U.S. massive complex estate. The proxy granted Preston full, unchecked legal authority over my personal medical decisions and my entire financial portfolio. Attached to the very back of the forged legal documents was a glossy-colored brochure and a completed intake form for a high-security private psychiatric facility located out in Macon, Georgia. It was a strict lockdown facility. Preston was not just planning to kick me out of my own home like he threatened at the graveyard. He was planning to declare me legally insane, strip me of my basic human rights, and lock me away in a sterile mental ward for the rest of my days. He wanted me completely erased from society so he could take total, unchallenged control of everything Beatrice and I had spent our lives building. He wanted to trap my daughter Sarah in that abusive marriage with absolutely no father around to protect her and no family money left to help her escape his grasp. He was going to throw me in a cage, sedate me with heavy medications, and throw away the key. I sat alone in the dim, quiet basement, surrounded by the chalky white dust of my broken walls, holding the very paperwork that was designed to be my own doom. The profound, suffocating grief that had been crushing me just an hour ago completely vanished. It was entirely replaced by a chilling, diamond-hard clarity. Preston truly thought he was dealing with a foolish, uneducated old physical laborer who would just roll over and accept his fate. He thought he could steal my dying wife, U.S. empire, abuse my only child, and bury me alive in a mental institution without a single fight. He made a fatal, catastrophic miscalculation. I carefully placed the forged legal documents back into the leather folder and closed the cover. I safely ejected the silver USB drive and slipped it deep into my pocket. I turned off the bright workbench light and stood up tall in the darkness of the basement. The quiet, peaceful morning period was officially over. It was time to go to war. I chose a small rundown diner off Interstate 20 about an hour outside the city limits. It was a modest establishment with peeling green paint on the exterior and a neon sign that constantly flickered in the gray afternoon gloom. It was the kind of place that served burnt bitter coffee and stale cherry pie. More importantly, it was the kind of place Preston and his elite country club friends would never be caught dead in. I needed to see my daughter far away from the prying eyes of her husband and his wealthy social circle. Getting her to agree to meet me had been a painful and terrifying ordeal. I had to use an old prepaid burner phone I bought at a local gas station just to bypass the tracking software I strongly suspected Preston had installed on her primary device. When she finally answered the unfamiliar number, she sounded like a frightened ghost jumping at her own shadow. We agreed on 2 in the afternoon. I arrived a full hour early to secure the safest spot. I sat in a faded red vinyl booth near the back corner, giving me a clear, unobstructed view of the main entrance and the rain-slicked parking lot. The waitress, a kind older woman, with a stained white apron and a tired smile, poured me a cup of black coffee without asking. I wrapped my thick, calloused hands around the warm ceramic mug and watched the relentless rain streak down the diner window. My mind was racing, churning with the absolute horrors I had uncovered in Beatrice U.S. hidden basement safe. The forged medical proxy, the stolen corporate funds, the offshore accounts. But all of that paper, all of those stolen millions faded into the distant background compared to the overwhelming, crushing anxiety I felt for my only child. Sarah was my absolute heart. When she was a little girl, she would run through the rail yard in her bright yellow boots, completely fearless, pointing at the massive trains with a brilliant, joyful smile. Now she was trapped in a golden cage built by a monster. I watched every car that pulled into the lot, praying she would show up safe. The little brass bell above the diner door jingled sharply. I looked up and saw her. My breath instantly hitched in my throat. Sarah walked in, shaking the cold rain from her expensive tan designer trench coat. To the untrained eye of a passing stranger, she looked like the perfect picture of upper-class wealth and privilege. Her hair was perfectly styled, and her clothes probably cost more than my very first car. But a father sees exactly what the rest of the world misses entirely. Her frame was painfully thin, fragile, like a brittle winter branch. The elegant, expensive clothes hung off her shoulders like they belonged on a wire hanger. Her face, once full of bright, vibrant life, was pale and hollow. Deep, dark circles shadowed her beautiful eyes, carefully concealed beneath thick layers of heavy makeup. She moved with a nervous, jerky energy, looking over her shoulder twice before she even spotted my booth in the back. She hurried over her heels, clicking softly on the checkered linoleum floor, and slid into the vinyl seat across from me. She did not take off her wet coat. She did not smile. She immediately placed her high-end smartphone face up on the table, staring at the dark screen, as if she expected it to explode at any given second. "Hello, sweetheart," I said, keeping my voice as low and soothing as humanly possible. I reached across the table, hoping to hold her hand to offer her some small piece of comfort. She gave me a tight, trembling nod, but kept her hands firmly locked in her lap. "Dad," she whispered, her voice barely carrying over the dull hum of the diner refrigerator. "I cannot stay long. If Preston finds out I drove out here, he will completely lose his mind. He thinks I am at a spa appointment downtown." The sheer raw terror radiating from my daughter made my chest physically ache. I asked her if she wanted something to eat, maybe a warm bowl of soup or a slice of pie. She shook her head frantically, her eyes darting toward the front window, watching the wet parking lot with paranoid intensity. The waitress returned, carrying a plastic pitcher of ice water. She set a tall glass in front of Sarah and reached across the table to fill it. As she pulled the pitcher back, a large, heavy chunk of ice slipped from the plastic spout, splashing a cold, sudden wave of water directly onto the table and over the edge toward Sarah's lap. It was a harmless, simple, clumsy accident. The waitress immediately started apologizing, reaching for a rag. But Sarah's reaction was absolutely devastating. She did not just jump back in surprise. She violently flinched, throwing her arms up to shield her face and her head, as if she fully expected to be struck with a heavy blow. She gasped a sharp, terrified whimpering sound that tore right through the very center of my soul. In her frantic defensive movement, her heavy trench coat slipped off her shoulder, and the sleeve of her green silk blouse slid up past her elbow. Time stopped entirely. The diner faded into complete silence. I stared at her pale, delicate forearm. Stamped aggressively into her fragile skin were dark purple and ugly yellow bruises. They were unmistakable. They were the distinct, brutal shapes of large human fingers. A massive, heavy hand had gripped her arm with vicious, crushing force, leaving a permanent record of absolute cruelty. I stopped breathing. The diner around me, the clattering dishes, the smell of fried bacon, the rain drumming on the glass. Everything simply vanished. For 35 years, I managed the dangerous, unpredictable chaos of the rail yards. I was a man trained to keep his composure in the face of imminent disaster. But looking at those violent, ugly marks on my little girl's arm, the father in me wanted to completely tear the entire world apart. The raw, burning heartbreak in my chest instantly crystallized into absolute freezing rage. A dark, violent, primal urge screamed in my mind, urging me to drive straight to Buckhead, drag Preston out of his luxury mansion by his tailored silk collar, and break every single bone in his hands. I wanted to destroy him physically right then and there. I wanted to show him exactly what a father-us wrath looked like. But I forced myself to remain planted in my vinyl seat. I clenched my jaw so hard, my teeth ached. I remembered the forged medical proxy resting securely in my basement. If I laid a single angry finger on Preston, he would call the police and I would be locked away in a jail cell or a psychiatric ward before sunset. He would use my righteous anger to paint me as an insane, violent old man, and Sarah would be left completely alone, permanently trapped in his clutches. I took a deep, slow, ragged breath, forcing the white-hot fire in my gut to cool into a sharp, calculated weapon. Sarah realized her sleeve had slipped, revealing her shameful secret. She let out a panicked, broken sob and desperately yanked the expensive silk fabric down to her wrist, trying to hide the undeniable evidence of her husband's monstrous cruelty. "Oh God, Dad, please," she whimpered, burying her face in her trembling hands. "Please do not look at me like that. I am so sorry. I am so sorry." I reached across the small table and gently pulled her hands away from her face. My voice was rock steady, calm, and deeply anchored, even though my heart was bleeding out. "Sarah, look at me," I said, locking my dark eyes onto hers. "You have absolutely nothing to be sorry for. None of this is your fault. Tell me exactly what that coward has done to you." The emotional dam finally broke. The elegant, wealthy facade completely crumbled into dust, and my beautiful daughter wept with the heavy, exhausted sorrow of someone who had been carrying the crushing weight of the world completely alone. She told me everything: the daily emotional torment, the constant vicious belittling, the forced isolation from her friends. The physical abuse that started with hard shoves in the hallway and escalated to violent grabbing and shaking whenever he lost his fragile temper. But then she revealed a layer of systemic, calculated betrayal that made my blood run even colder. "Dad," she cried, wiping her ruined running makeup with a cheap paper napkin. "I am completely trapped. It is not just the big house or the fancy cars. Preston completely destroyed my credit and my financial identity. Over the last 2 grueling years, he secretly took out $300,000 in fraudulent business loans and he put my name on every single piece of paper. He forged my signature on complex bank documents I never even read. I sat there in stunned silence, absorbing the sheer, horrifying magnitude of his financial wickedness. $300,000 in toxic debt chained directly to my daughter-us name. When I tried to leave him last month, he laughed right in my face. Sarah continued, her voice shaking with raw, visceral panic. He told me he transferred all our liquid cash into a private offshore account I cannot legally access. He completely froze my personal checking and savings accounts. He said if I try to pack a bag and run, he will report the heavy loans as my own personal fraud and let the corporate banks tear me to shreds. He told me I would end up in a federal prison, and he would make sure I looked like a crazy, desperate thief to the judge. He has cut off all my credit cards. I do not even have enough cash in my wallet to rent a cheap hotel room or hire a decent lawyer. He owns me, Dad. He literally owns me. The cold, calculated evil of Preston U.S. master plan was utterly staggering. He was not just physically beating my daughter in the shadows of their mansion. He was holding her hostage with a meticulously designed financial prison. He knew if she had absolutely no money and a ruined public reputation, she could never escape his absolute control. He had weaponized the entire banking system to keep his favorite punching bag permanently locked inside his expensive house. I leaned forward, gripping the edge of the diner table with my large hands. "You are leaving him today," I stated firmly, leaving absolutely no room for negotiation or debate. "You are coming home with me right now. I do not care about the frozen credit cards or the massive fraudulent loans right now. We will handle all of it." Sarah violently shook her head, pulling back and grabbing my forearm with terrifying desperation. "No, Dad, no, you do not understand," she pleaded, her eyes wide and frantic, darting around the empty diner. "You cannot fight him. You do not know the kind of powerful people he knows. His family has deep connections with high court judges, wealthy corporate bankers, and the district attorney. If you try to stand up to him, he will utterly destroy you too. He hates you, Dad. He has always hated you. He talks about how incredibly easy it would be to ruin a retired black rail yard worker. If you try to take me away from him, he will twist the law and crush you into the dirt. Please, Daddy, just let it go. I will figure it out. I just need a little more time." Hearing my daughter beg me to submit to a monster out of pure fear for my own safety was the most profound, searing agony I have ever experienced in my 68 years of life. She truly believed that Preston-us white-collar privilege and elite legal connections made him an untouchable god among men. She thought her hard-working blue-collar father was nothing but a powerless old man facing an unbeatable giant. I looked at her tear-stained face, the bruised, swollen arm trembling under the green silk, and the sheer terror clouding her beautiful eyes. I did not raise my voice. I did not shout or pound my heavy fists on the diner table. I simply placed my large, calloused hand over hers and held it with unyielding, protective strength. "You listen to me, Sarah," I said, my voice dropping to a quiet, dangerous register. "I spent 35 years moving thousands of tons of steel. I know exactly how momentum works. Preston thinks his money and his fancy friends make him an unstoppable freight train. But a train is only powerful if it stays on the tracks. I am going to rip the tracks right out from under him. He is going to lose everything he loves, and I am going to do it without ever throwing a single punch." The drive from the diner into the heart of downtown Atlanta felt like navigating through a completely different world. The heavy rain had finally stopped, leaving the city streets slick and shining under the gray afternoon light. I gripped the steering wheel of my old pickup truck, focusing entirely on the rhythm of the road to keep my burning anger fully contained. My mind kept flashing back to the horrific dark bruises on my daughter's fragile arm. Every time that image surfaced, a violent roar echoed in my chest. But I knew that brute force would only play right into the trap Preston had so carefully laid out for me. I needed a weapon far more precise and devastating than my own two hands. I needed someone who understood the ruthless mechanics of wealth and power. I needed someone who could lock the legal doors before Preston even realized he was trapped inside a burning room. I needed Mitchell. Mitchell was Beatrice's older brother. He was a retired state judge and currently a senior partner at one of the most ruthless, prestigious law firms in the entire state of Georgia. For 35 long years, Mitchell and I had maintained a relationship defined by cold, polite distance and unspoken tension. He was a wealthy, highly educated white man, born into generations of old money and societal privilege. I was a black man who spent his life covered in diesel grease managing noisy freight trains in the humid Georgia heat. From the very first day Beatrice brought me home to meet her family, Mitchell had looked at me as if I were a poor, unfortunate mistake his sister was making. He never raised his voice or used ugly words, but his quiet condescension was always perfectly clear. During our holiday dinners, he would speak over me, direct his questions only to Beatrice, and treat my blue-collar profession like some sort of charming little hobby. When Sarah married Preston, Mitchell had been absolutely thrilled. Preston was exactly the kind of man Mitchell understood and respected. A smooth-talking, well-dressed white real estate broker with a country club membership and a relentless drive for corporate expansion. Mitchell saw Preston as the perfect addition to their elite circle. He had no idea that the golden boy he so deeply admired was currently suffocating his niece and tearing their family legacy to shreds. I knew walking into Mitchell U.S. territory was going to be a humiliating, bitter pill to swallow. I would have to endure his judgment and his arrogant assumptions. But for Sarah, I was willing to walk barefoot through a field of broken glass. I parked my battered truck in the cavernous underground parking garage beneath a towering skyscraper of glass and steel. I rode the silent high-speed elevator up to the top floor, stepping out into a reception area that screamed of quiet, intimidating wealth. The floors were polished Italian marble, and the walls were lined with rich, dark mahogany. A young receptionist behind a massive granite desk looked up at me. Her eyes quickly scanned my simple faded work jacket and my heavy scuffed boots. Her polite smile did not quite reach her eyes. She asked if I was lost or delivering a package. I planted my feet firmly on the expensive rug and told her in a voice that demanded absolute obedience to tell Judge Mitchell his brother-in-law was here to see him immediately. She hesitated, stammering about appointments and schedules, but I did not blink. I told her I was not leaving until I saw him. After a tense, uncomfortable phone call, she gestured toward a set of heavy double doors down the hallway. I walked past her, my heavy boots sinking deeply into the plush carpet. I pushed the heavy wooden doors open and stepped into Mitchell U.S. private corner office. It was a massive room with floor-to-ceiling windows, offering a sweeping, panoramic view of the entire Atlanta skyline. Mitchell was sitting behind an enormous mahogany desk, meticulously reviewing a stack of legal briefs. He was a tall, imposing man, with thick silver hair, sharp gray eyes, and a tailored suit that probably cost more than my mortgage payments. He did not bother to stand up when I entered. He simply took off his reading glasses, placed them deliberately on his desk, and let out a long, exasperated sigh. "Roland," he said, his voice dripping with tired irritation. "This is highly irregular. You cannot simply barge into my corporate office without an appointment. I have a firm schedule to maintain, and I am currently preparing for a major deposition." I closed the heavy doors behind me, making sure they clicked firmly shut. I walked slowly across the massive room, feeling the sheer weight of his wealthy authority pressing down on me. I stopped right in front of his polished desk, looking down at him. I told him I needed exactly 10 minutes of his time. Mitchell leaned back in his expensive leather chair, steepling his fingers together. His gray eyes swept over me, analyzing my tired posture and my worn-out clothes. He let out a dry, humorless chuckle. "I suppose I know exactly why you are here, Roland," he said, his tone entirely condescending. "The official will reading is approaching, and you are feeling the sudden, harsh reality of your situation. Beatrice is gone. The retail empire she built is moving into its next phase of corporate transition. You are worried about your slice of the pie. You want to know if there is an advance you can take from the estate, or perhaps a quiet settlement we can arrange to keep you comfortable in your old age." I stood completely still, letting his insulting assumptions hang in the quiet air. He truly believed I was a broken, greedy old man begging for handouts from his wealthy family. "Look," Roland Mitchell continued, softening his voice with a sickening kind of fake pity. "I know you loved my sister. I know you were there for her in your own simple way. But let us be brutally honest with each other. Beatrice was the financial engine of your marriage. You worked hard in the rail yard, yes, but this level of wealth, this kind of massive corporate estate, requires a sophisticated hand. It requires a mind trained in modern finance and high-stakes asset management. Preston is perfectly equipped to step up and handle these heavy responsibilities. He has the background, the education, and the pedigree to ensure Sarah's U.S. future is protected. You should just be deeply grateful for the time you had and step aside gracefully. Do not try to contest the will. Do not make this a messy public affair. If you need a small, quiet stipend to secure a little apartment somewhere, I am sure we can arrange something reasonable." Every single word he spoke was coated in decades of blind, arrogant prejudice. He was effectively telling me to take a cheap payoff and disappear into the shadows so the real men could handle the family business. He thought Preston was a brilliant savior. He thought I was nothing but a helpless burden. I reached into the inner pocket of my faded jacket. I did not raise my voice, and I did not let a single ounce of my burning rage show on my face. I pulled out the thick, heavy leather dossier I had retrieved from the hidden biometric safe in my basement. I raised the dossier high and slammed it down onto the center of his pristine mahogany desk. The loud, heavy thud echoed sharply across the massive room, making Mitchell physically flinch in his expensive chair. "I do not care about your money, Mitchell," I said, my voice dangerously calm and absolutely freezing. "I have provided for myself my entire life, and I do not need a single penny from your deep pockets. But that golden boy son-in-law of yours is financially suffocating your niece and bleeding your family trust completely dry." Mitchell stared at me, his silver eyebrows drawing together in deep confusion and sudden anger. He looked down at the dark leather dossier sitting on his desk, and then back up at my face. "What on earth are you talking about?" he demanded, his voice losing its polished calm. "Are you making wild accusations against Preston simply because you feel threatened by his position? This is pathetic, Roland, even for you." I did not move. I pointed a thick, calloused finger at the heavy folder. "Open it," I commanded. "Open it right now, and put your brilliant legal mind to work. Look at the numbers, Mitchell. Look at the signatures. You think I am a simple, ignorant laborer who cannot understand corporate finance. Beatrice knew exactly what I was capable of. She knew I could handle the ugly, dirty work when the time came. She gathered all of this before she died. She hid it in a safe only I could access because she knew her own flesh and blood would be too blinded by Preston's expensive suits to see the monster hiding underneath." Mitchell hesitated. The raw, absolute certainty in my voice finally pierced through his thick armor of arrogance. He reached out with cautious hands and flipped open the heavy leather cover. He put his reading glasses back on his face and looked at the very first page. It was a comprehensive bank statement from Beatrice U.S. Primary Holding Company. I stood over him and spoke in cold, undeniable facts, laying out the exact corporate logic he respected so deeply. Over the last 24 months, Preston has systematically funneled over $1 million out of Beatrice U.S. retail accounts, I said, watching his eyes scan the highlighted numbers. He created 3 phantom contracting companies. He double-billed the estate for retail renovations that never actually happened. He routed the stolen funds through a tangled web of offshore accounts located in the Cayman Islands. Mitchell's face went completely pale. His eyes darted rapidly across the columns of numbers. His breathing became shallow and fast. But wait, he muttered, his voice trembling slightly. Beatrice signed off on these transfers. Her signature is right here on the authorization forms. Turn to page 14, I instructed, keeping my tone completely flat and clinical. Mitchell quickly flipped a thick section of pages. He stared at a series of highly magnified side-by-side signature comparisons. Beatrice had carefully matched the signatures on the transfer forms against her own authentic handwriting. Preston forged her name, I explained. Watching the devastating truth slowly wash over the former judge, he used her declining health as a convenient cover. He assumed nobody would question the financial movements of a dying woman. He stole from his own mother-in-law while she was physically fighting for her life in a hospital bed. Mitchell was entirely silent. The quiet, confident arrogance that had defined him for 35 years was violently crumbling right before my eyes. He flipped to the next section of the dossier, his hands now visibly shaking. And it gets much worse, I continued, stepping closer to the desk so my voice would echo directly in his ears. Turn to the section marked with Sarah's name. Look at what your perfect golden boy has done to your precious niece. Mitchell turned the pages, and a sharp, horrifying gasp escaped his lips. He was looking at official loan documents and credit statements. He secretly took out $300,000 in fraudulent commercial loans using Sarah U.S. identity, I stated, my chest tightening with raw pain as I forced myself to say the words out loud. He froze all of her personal banking accounts. He trapped her in a financial prison so she could never afford to hire a lawyer or escape his control. He totally isolated her. Mitchell looked up at me, his gray eyes wide with absolute horror. Sarah, he whispered, his voice breaking. He did this to little Sarah. I leaned over the desk, placing both of my heavy hands flat on the polished wood. I looked directly into the soul of the man who had judged me my entire life. Today I met my daughter at a miserable diner out on the highway. I said, my voice vibrating with a dark, lethal intensity. When she reached across the table, her sleeve slipped up. Her arm was completely covered in dark purple bruises, Mitchell. The bruises were shaped exactly like a man U.S. heavy fingers. Your brilliant, educated country club son-in-law is beating my daughter in the dark. He is crushing her spirit and holding her hostage with the very money he stole from your sister. The silence in the massive office was absolutely deafening. The distant hum of the city traffic far below the window completely faded away. Mitchell stared at me, and for the very first time in our long, difficult history, he did not see a black rail yard worker. He did not see an inferior, uneducated laborer. He saw a deeply terrified, furious father who was fighting a desperate war to save the only child he had left. Mitchell looked back down at the final document in the folder. It was the forged medical proxy Preston had created to lock me away in a psychiatric facility. The sheer evil magnitude of the betrayal completely shattered the last remaining pieces of Mitchell U.S. elite worldview. The man he had welcomed into his family, the man he had proudly introduced to his powerful friends, was a ruthless, violent predator. A profound, heavy transformation occurred right in front of me. Mitchell took a deep, shuddering breath and slowly closed the leather folder. When he looked back up at me, his gray eyes were no longer filled with shock or disbelief. They were entirely black with cold, calculating, righteous fury. The retired state judge, the man who had sent hundreds of violent criminals to prison over his long career, had fully awakened. He took off his reading glasses and tossed them onto the desk. He stood up slowly from his expensive leather chair, smoothing the front of his tailored suit jacket. He walked around the massive mahogany desk and stopped right in front of me. We were two incredibly different men from entirely different worlds. We had never understood each other, and we had never truly liked each other. But in that exact moment, staring into each other's eyes, we shared a single, unbreakable bond. We were both older men who loved Beatrice, and we both possessed a burning, ruthless need to protect Sarah from the monster who was trying to destroy her. Roland Mitchell said, his voice deadly quiet and vibrating with absolute menace. I have spent my entire professional career upholding the precise letter of the law. I know exactly how to dismantle a man's life piece by piece until he has absolutely nothing left but the clothes on his back. Preston thinks he is clever. He thinks his real estate licenses and his offshore accounts make him untouchable. Mitchell reached out and placed a firm, reassuring hand on my shoulder. It was the very first time he had ever touched me with genuine respect. We are going to burn his entire world straight to the ground, Mitchell stated, his eyes locked firmly onto mine. We are going to take everything he stole. We are going to lock him in a federal prison cell, and we are going to make sure he never breathes a single breath of free air again. I nodded slowly, feeling a massive heavy weight finally lift off my exhausted shoulders. I did not have to fight this desperate war completely alone. I had walked into the Lion U.S. den expecting a brutal fight for survival, and instead, I had secured the most powerful, dangerous ally in the entire state of Georgia. Mitchell walked over to his heavy wooden door and locked it firmly from the inside. He walked over to his private bar, poured 2 small glasses of straight whiskey, and handed one directly to me. We did not toast. We simply drank the burning liquid in complete, absolute silence. Now, Mitchell said, setting his empty glass down and rolling up the sleeves of his expensive white shirt. The official will reading is scheduled for Thursday afternoon. Preston will be expecting a smooth, easy transition of power. He will walk into that boardroom thinking he has successfully conquered this entire family. I set my glass down next to his, a cold, dark smile finally touching the corners of my mouth. He thinks I am just a useless old man who does not know how to fight back, I replied. Mitchell pulled a yellow legal pad toward him and grabbed a heavy gold pen. Then let us show him exactly what happens when 2 useless old men decide to rewrite the ending of his story, Mitchell said. A powerful, silent alliance was officially forged in the quiet, sterile heights of that skyscraper. Preston Thorne had foolishly awakened a sleeping giant, and now he was about to face the combined wrath of the 2 most dangerous men in Atlanta. The morning rain had finally washed the Atlanta streets clean, but the atmosphere inside my home remained heavy and thick with an unspoken tension. It had been exactly 2 days since I walked out of Mitchell U.S. towering glass office. 2 days since the former judge and I formed an unspoken pact to absolutely obliterate the man who was terrorizing my daughter. I was sitting at the kitchen table drinking a cup of bitter black coffee, tracing the familiar grain of the wooden surface. Beatrice and I had shared thousands of quiet, peaceful mornings right here in this very room. I could almost hear her voice echoing in the quiet spaces of the house, telling me to stay sharp, to keep my eyes wide open, and my temper strictly in check. Suddenly, the deep rumbling sound of heavy diesel engines shattered the morning peace. I looked out the large bay window and felt a cold, heavy knot tighten deep in my stomach. Three massive commercial moving trucks were pulling aggressively into my long, circular driveway. The heavy tires ruthlessly crushed the vibrant flower beds Beatrice had planted with her own two hands just last spring. The loud hydraulic brakes hissed as the trucks parked boxing in my old faded pickup truck. The cargo doors swung open, and a dozen burly men in matching gray uniforms piled out, stretching their arms and loudly lowering the heavy metal loading ramps. Right behind the convoy of trucks, a sleek silver sports car slid aggressively into the driveway. Preston stepped out. He was wearing a sharply tailored navy blue suit, his hair slicked back perfectly, his posture oozing that sickening blend of unearned wealth and arrogant white-collar privilege. He adjusted his expensive silk tie and marched straight up my front steps. He did not bother to knock. He did not ring the doorbell. He simply turned the doorknob and pushed his way into my home like he already owned the very air inside it. I stood up slowly from the kitchen table, my heavy work boots planting firmly on the tile floor. I watched him stride down the hallway, his polished leather shoes clicking sharply against the hardwood. He casually signaled for the moving crew to wait out on the front porch, leaving the heavy oak door wide open behind him. The cool, damp morning breeze swept into the house, but it was nothing compared to the absolute freezing chill radiating from my son-in-law's smug, smiling face. He looked at me the way a man looks at a piece of discarded trash blocking his path. "Good morning, Roland," Preston said, his voice dripping with forced mock politeness. He walked right into the kitchen and tossed a thick stack of stapled papers onto the table. The heavy thud of the documents sounded exactly like a judge bringing down a final gavel. "I hope you have some sturdy cardboard boxes handy because your time in this exclusive neighborhood has officially expired." I looked down at the papers resting on my table. It was the forged medical proxy and the durable power of attorney I had discovered hidden inside Beatrice U.S. biometric safe just a few days ago. The fake signatures, the fabricated dementia diagnosis, the forced commitment to a secure psychiatric facility in Macon. He had actually filed them. He had put his ruthless master plan into motion a full 3 days before the official will reading was even scheduled to take place. He was not just trying to steal my home, he was trying to erase me from society before the lawyers could even open Beatrice's final testament. He wanted me locked away and heavily medicated before I could speak a single word in my own defense. "I am giving you exactly 24 hours to pack whatever cheap, ragged clothes you want to keep," Preston announced, leaning his palms flat on the kitchen table and staring me dead in the eyes. "I have a private medical transport arriving tomorrow morning at 9 sharp. They are going to escort you to a lovely, secure facility out in the country. The doctors there specialize in treating severe grief-induced dementia. You will be very comfortable, Roland. They have locked doors, padded rooms, and plenty of strong medication to keep your confused mind quiet. You will not have to worry about a single thing ever again." The sheer unfiltered evil vibrating in his voice made my thick, calloused hands curl into tight, heavy fists. I felt the familiar, hot, violent surge of adrenaline flooding my veins. My chest heaved as I stared at this flashy, arrogant boy who thought he could simply discard a veteran rail yard supervisor like a piece of broken, useless machinery. Every single muscle in my 68-year-old body begged me to reach across that table, grab him by his tailored throat, and show him exactly what kind of brutal physical strength a working man possesses. I could have snapped his collarbone before those movers outside even realized what was happening. I spent 35 years hauling heavy iron chains and throwing track switches that weighed more than he did. Breaking him in half would have been the easiest thing in the world. But Beatrice's dying words echoed loudly in the back of my mind, piercing through the red-hot fog of my anger. Let him dig his own grave, Roland. Let him get so arrogant that he trips over his own enormous ego. Use your mind, not your hands. I had to play the game. I had to become the exact pathetic, broken victim Preston wanted to see. I had to give him the ultimate illusion of total victory so he would willingly walk completely blind into the devastating trap Mitchell and I were building for him. I had to swallow my immense pride to save my daughter's life. I slowly released the tight tension in my heavy fists. I let my broad shoulders slump forward, completely collapsing the strong, proud posture I had maintained my entire life. I lowered my gaze, staring weakly at the linoleum floor, as if the sheer weight of his words had physically crushed my spirit. I forced my hands to shake a visible, pathetic tremor that made my coffee cup rattle loudly against its ceramic saucer. I let my breathing become ragged and shallow, simulating a severe panic attack. "Preston, please," I whispered, pitching my voice to sound raspy, frightened, and hopelessly confused. "This is my home. Beatrice and I built this house from the ground up. You cannot just throw me out into the street. I am not sick. My mind is perfectly fine. I just miss my wife. I am just grieving. You cannot do this to me." Preston let out a sharp, cruel laugh. It was a sound completely devoid of any human empathy. He walked around the table and stood entirely too close to me, invading my personal space with his overpowering, expensive cologne. "You do not own anything anymore, old man," he sneered, his tone shifting into pure, undisguised venom. "Beatrice was the only reason you ever set foot in a zip code like this. You were just the hired help she kept around out of misguided pity. Now that she is gone, you are nothing but a massive financial liability to this estate." He tapped his manicured finger sharply against the stack of forged documents. "The state has already reviewed the medical files. A judge has signed off on the transfer of power. You are legally incompetent, Roland. You are a ward of the state, and I am your newly appointed legal guardian. Sarah fully supports this decision. If you try to fight the medical transport tomorrow morning, the police will simply drag you out in handcuffs and throw you in the back of a squad car. Is that how you want your wealthy neighbors to see you? Screaming and kicking like a rabid animal while they haul you away to the madhouse." Hearing him casually use my daughter's name as a weapon made my stomach turn with absolute disgust. He was trying to convince me that Sarah had abandoned me too. I kept my head bowed, my eyes fixed firmly on the ground. I squeezed my eyes shut, squeezing out a few genuine tears of absolute frustration and hidden rage. But to Preston, they looked exactly like the helpless tears of a broken, defeated old man who had completely given up on life. I let my lower lip tremble. I raised my shaking hands in a desperate, pleading gesture, showing him the vulnerable palms of my hands. "Just give me a little more time," I begged, my voice cracking, pathetically echoing through the large kitchen. "Please, Preston. 24 hours is simply not enough. All of Beatrice's memories are inside this house. Her photographs, her favorite dresses, the tiny blanket she knit for Sarah when she was a little baby. I cannot pack 35 years of a beautiful marriage into a single cardboard box in one day. Just give me 48 hours. Let me have 2 more nights to say goodbye to my home. Let me pack my things with some small shred of dignity. I will not cause any trouble. I will go quietly to the facility in Macon. I will sign whatever you want me to sign. Just please let me have 2 more days." Preston stared at me. The silence in the kitchen stretched out, agonizing and thick. I could feel his cold, calculating eyes burning into the top of my bowed head. He was evaluating my pathetic performance, weighing his absolute power against my humiliating surrender. He loved this. He was completely intoxicated by the sheer dominance of the moment. He genuinely believed he had crushed the soul out of a tough blue-collar man without breaking a single sweat. He thought he was watching the total destruction of my entire legacy. He let out a slow, deeply satisfied sigh. He reached out and actually patted me condescendingly on the shoulder, like I was a frightened, obedient dog seeking approval from its cruel master. "Look at you. Preston mocked, a nasty, victorious smirk spreading across his handsome face. The big, tough rail yard boss begging for crumbs in his own kitchen. You know, Roland, I always told Sarah you were just a weak, ignorant relic. She used to look up to you, but now she finally sees you for exactly what you are. A completely useless, washed-up old nobody taking up valuable space. He pulled his hand away in disgust, adjusting his pristine white cuffs. 48 hours, he declared, his voice ringing with supreme, unearned authority. You get exactly 48 hours to pack up your pathetic little life. The medical transport team will be here on Thursday morning, right before I head downtown for the official will reading. If you are not sitting on the front porch with your bags packed and ready to go by 9 a.m., I will personally have the sheriff kick the front door down and drag you out by your gray hair. Do we understand each other, old man? I nodded slowly, keeping my chin tucked firmly against my chest, playing the broken victim until the very bitter end. I understand, Preston. I whispered, my voice deliberately fragile and incredibly small. Thank you for your mercy. Preston let out one final barking laugh of pure triumph. He turned his back on me, completely dismissing my existence, and marched down the hallway. He shouted orders at the waiting moving crew, telling them to stand down and return on Thursday morning. The heavy oak front door slammed shut behind him, rattling the expensive picture frames hanging on the walls. I listened to his high-powered sports car roar to life and speed down the driveway, aggressively scattering the loose gravel into the street. I stood completely alone in the quiet kitchen. The moment the sound of his loud engine faded into the distance, the pathetic trembling in my hands immediately stopped. My broad shoulders squared, pulling back into their natural, commanding posture. I lifted my head and stared at the empty doorway, my dark eyes completely dry and burning with a lethal, freezing intensity. Preston had taken this bait perfectly. His massive, blinding ego had convinced him that I was completely conquered. He believed his brutal home invasion had secured his absolute, unchecked victory. He thought granting me an extra 24 hours was just a cruel, sadistic way to twist the knife in my back. He had absolutely no idea that those exact 24 hours were the final, crucial pieces of the puzzle I desperately needed. His supreme arrogance had just handed me the precise window of time required to arm the legal explosives that would blow his entire fraudulent empire to dust. I reached deep into my pocket and pulled out my phone, dialing Mitchell U.S. Private Direct Line. The former judge answered on the very first ring, his tone sharp and ready for action. He bought the entire performance. I said, my voice dropping into a low, dangerous register, returning to the confident tone of a man who managed massive moving trains. He gave me until Thursday morning. Mitchell let out a dark, grim chuckle on the other end of the line. The sound of two old men perfectly aligned in their mission for absolute destruction. Right on schedule, Roland, Mitchell replied smoothly. The forensic financial audits are complete, and the federal warrants are currently being drawn up by the district attorney. The blind trust is fully armed and completely hidden from public record. The trap is completely set. I looked down at the forged medical documents Preston had arrogantly thrown onto my kitchen table. I picked them up with a steady hand and dropped them directly into the trash can where they belonged. Let the final countdown begin, I replied. The rumble of that expensive engine had barely faded down my street before the heavy, suffocating mask of a defeated old man completely melted off my face. I stood alone in the hallway, breathing in the quiet air of the house my wife and I had built. My hands were no longer shaking. The blood roaring in my ears slowed down to a steady, relentless march. For 35 years down at the Atlanta rail yards, I had learned that panic gets people killed. When a massive steel freight train slips its brakes, you do not stand on the tracks and scream. You run ahead and you switch the rails. Preston thought I was tied to the tracks. He had no idea I was the man standing inside the control tower. I pulled the burner phone from my pocket and dialed a number I had memorized over the last 48 hours. Mitchell answered on the very first ring. I did not bother with pleasantries. I told him our golden boy had just paid me a visit with a moving crew and a pocket full of forged medical documents. I told him Preston had graciously given me a 24-hour extension to pack up my pathetic little life before the men in white coats came to drag me to a padded cell in Macon. A heavy, thick silence hung on the other end of the line. Then Mitchell let out a low, sharp breath, the kind of breath a judge takes right before he hands down a maximum sentence. He told me to get down to his office immediately. The legal team was already waiting. I grabbed my keys and walked out into the damp Georgia morning. The rain from earlier had left the asphalt slick and reflecting the gray sky. I climbed into my old faded pickup truck, turning the key and listening to the reliable rumble of the engine. Driving through the sprawling suburbs of Atlanta, toward the towering glass and steel skyline of the financial district, my mind drifted to my late wife. Beatrice had always been a woman who planned for winter, while everyone else was busy enjoying the summer sun. When she first started expanding her boutique retail stores, she used to sit at the kitchen table until 3 in the morning, running numbers, running risk assessments, and mapping out every single worst-case scenario. I used to rub her tired shoulders and tell her she worried too much. She would look up at me with those sharp, beautiful eyes and tell me that a good business is built on trust, but a great business is built on airtight legal armor. I never truly understood the absolute depth of her brilliance until today. I pulled into the underground parking garage beneath Mitchell U.S. towering corporate firm. The tires of my worn-out truck squeaked against the polished concrete. I walked into the private elevator and rode it all the way up to the executive floor. The doors slid open to reveal Mitchell standing in the reception area waiting for me. He did not look like the arrogant, dismissive brother-in-law I had known for decades. He looked like a veteran general preparing for a massive siege. He extended his hand and gripped mine with a firm, unyielding solidarity. We walked together down the long, quiet corridor and pushed open the heavy oak doors of the main conference room. Sitting around a massive granite table were 3 incredibly sharp-looking corporate litigators. They wore immaculate dark suits and carried the kind of serious, focused energy that told me they billed by the minute and never lost a case. Mitchell took his seat at the head of the table and gestured for me to sit beside him. The lead attorney, a tall, sharp-featured man named Harrison, slid a thick stack of blue legal binders toward the center of the table. He looked at me with a profound level of professional respect. Harrison explained that Mitchell had briefed them on the fraudulent loans, the stolen retail funds, and the forged medical proxy Preston intended to use against me. But then Harrison opened the top binder and revealed something that made my heart physically ache with overwhelming love and admiration for my late wife. Beatrice had not just been tracking Preston's theft in secret. She had actively restructured the fundamental foundation of her entire commercial estate months before the cancer finally took her. Harrison pulled out a heavily notarized document and placed it right in front of me. He called it the poison pill. In the high-stakes world of corporate finance, a poison pill is a defensive strategy used by a target company to prevent or discourage a hostile takeover. Beatrice had taken that aggressive corporate concept and weaponized it to protect her family. The clause was buried deep within an obscure addendum of her living trust, completely invisible to Preston's greedy, prying eyes. Harrison explained the legal mechanics with surgical precision. The clause explicitly stated that if any named heir or their legal spouse attempted to seize assets through fraudulent means, engaged in documented financial abuse, or attempted to forcibly declare the primary beneficiary medically incompetent, their entire stake in the inheritance would be immediately and irrevocably liquidated. I stared at the thick legal paper tracing Beatrice's elegant sweeping signature at the bottom of the page. She knew. She had known all along that her son-in-law was a predator waiting in the tall grass. She knew that once she was gone, he would try to devour Sarah and throw me to the wolves. She did not have the physical strength left to fight him in court, while her body was failing, so she built a financial landmine directly into her will and handed me the detonator. My vision blurred for a brief moment. I swallowed the thick, heavy lump of grief in my throat. I asked Harrison what we needed to do to trigger the clause. Mitchell leaned forward, intertwining his fingers on the granite table. He explained that a poison pill was only effective if the hostile party actually tried to swallow it. Preston had already committed the financial crimes, but we needed him to officially cross the point of no return in a fully documented legal setting. We needed him to walk into the official will reading tomorrow, completely confident, and sign his name on the dotted line claiming his fraudulent prize. Once he signed that specific document, he would officially trigger the hidden clause. But Mitchell and I were not going to stop at simply disinheriting that monster. We wanted him completely dismantled. We wanted to make absolutely certain he could never terrorize my daughter or any other innocent person ever again. Harrison slid a second stack of documents toward me. This was the final devastating blow. It was the paperwork to immediately transfer every single legitimate asset, every boutique store, every commercial property, and every cent of liquid capital into an impenetrable blind trust. I would be the sole trustee, but the assets would be completely shielded from any outside legal maneuvering. Furthermore, the documents included a direct binding authorization to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The moment Preston signed his name tomorrow, attempting to execute his hostile takeover, the blind trust would automatically seal the estate and instantly transmit the entire dossier of his financial crimes to the federal authorities. The offshore wire transfers, the forged commercial loans bearing Sarah U.S. stolen identity, the fake medical evaluations, everything would hit the desk of a federal prosecutor before Preston even had time to finish his celebratory glass of bourbon. Harrison handed me a heavy gold fountain pen. He told me that by signing these documents, I was giving up my right to a quiet, peaceful transition of my wife's U.S. estate. I was actively inviting a massive federal investigation into my own family U.S. finances. He asked me if I was absolutely certain I wanted to unleash this kind of chaotic destruction. I did not even blink. I took the heavy gold pen and gripped it firmly in my calloused hand. I thought about the dark purple bruises blooming across my beautiful daughter's fragile arm. I thought about the sheer terror in her eyes when she begged me not to fight back because she believed her husband was an untouchable god. I thought about the vile racist words Preston had spit into my face as I stood over my wife's open grave. I pressed the nib of the pen against the thick parchment paper. I signed my name with bold, heavy strokes, making sure the ink bled deep into the page. I signed my name on the first page, then the second, then the third. The quiet, scratching sound of the pen echoed through the large boardroom. With every single signature, I felt a massive, heavy chain snapping. I was breaking my daughter out of her prison. I was honoring the magnificent, fierce legacy of the woman who had loved me for 35 years. When I finished the final page, I pushed the stack of documents back across the granite table. Harrison carefully gathered the paperwork, inspecting the signatures with a satisfied, professional nod. He closed the thick blue binders and locked them securely inside a heavy leather briefcase. The trap was now fully armed and completely lethal. There was absolutely no turning back for any of us. Mitchell stood up from his chair and walked over to me. He placed his hand on my shoulder, giving it a firm, heavy squeeze. We stood there in the quiet boardroom, looking out the massive windows at the sprawling city of Atlanta below. The gray clouds were finally beginning to part, letting a few weak rays of afternoon sunlight pierce through the gloom. Mitchell told me to go home and get some rest. He said tomorrow was going to be the longest, most difficult day of my entire life. I told him I had worked double shifts in the freezing rain, loading steel onto freight trains. Tomorrow was not going to be difficult. Tomorrow was going to be a reckoning. I left the towering corporate building and drove my old pickup truck back to my quiet, empty house. The front yard still bore the deep, ugly tire tracks from Preston U.S. moving trucks. The crushed flower beds were a bitter reminder of his aggressive, brazen intrusion. I walked up the front steps and unlocked my front door. The house was completely silent, but it no longer felt heavy with suffocating grief. It felt entirely different. It felt like the calm, quiet atmosphere right before a massive, devastating storm makes landfall. I walked into the kitchen and poured the remaining cold, black coffee down the sink. I washed the ceramic mug and placed it neatly on the drying rack. I walked into the living room and sat down in my worn-out leather recliner. I did not turn on the television. I did not turn on the lamps. I just sat in the fading twilight, mentally preparing my mind and my spirit for the battle to come. I thought about Preston sitting in his luxurious mansion, probably drinking an expensive glass of whiskey, celebrating his perceived victory over an ignorant, useless old man. He thought he had completely outsmarted the world. He thought he held all the winning cards. I closed my eyes and let a slow, deep breath fill my lungs. The legal explosives were wired tight. The financial tripwires were completely invisible. The federal authorities were unknowingly waiting in the wings. Beatrice U.S. magnificent, brilliant trap was primed and ready to snap its steel jaws shut. I just had to wait for the sun to rise. I just had to wait for the arrogant boy to walk into the boardroom and arrogantly demand his stolen crown. The poison pill was waiting on the table. All Preston had to do was take a bite. I sat in the darkness for hours, letting the absolute gravity of the situation wash over me. For my entire life, I had been a man of physical action. When a train engine broke down, I grabbed my heavy steel wrenches and I fixed it. When my family needed money, I sacrificed my body to earn it. But this was an entirely different kind of warfare. This was a silent, invisible battle fought with ink paper and profound psychological discipline. I had to restrain every single natural instinct I possessed. I had to let a monster insult me, degrade me, and threaten me without ever raising my voice or lifting my heavy fists. It was the hardest labor I had ever endured. I walked upstairs to the master bedroom. The scent of Beatrice U.S. vanilla perfume still lingered faintly in the quiet air. I opened her large wooden armoire and gently ran my rough hands over her hanging dresses. I remembered the exact day she bought the emerald green silk one. We had finally paid off the mortgage on our house, and her retail business had just crossed a massive financial milestone. We had danced in the kitchen like two foolish teenagers completely drunk on our own hard-earned success. We had built an empire from absolutely nothing. And Preston had thought he could just waltz in and steal the entire kingdom because he had a fancy college degree and a cruel, manipulative heart. I walked over to the nightstand and picked up a framed photograph of Sarah. It was taken on the day of her high school graduation. Her smile was so bright, so incredibly full of radiant hope and innocent optimism. Preston had methodically extinguished that bright light. He had systematically dismantled her confidence, isolating her from the people who loved her, until she honestly believed she was completely worthless without him. He had used her profound love and her gentle nature against her, turning her into a terrified hostage in her own life. The anger flared up again, hot and bitter in the back of my throat, but I forced it back down. The time for anger was over. The time for clinical, absolute destruction was here. I went into my closet and pulled out the dark, tailored suit I had worn to Beatrice's U.S. funeral just a few days ago. I carefully brushed the fabric, smoothing out the wrinkles. I selected a crisp white dress shirt and a solid black tie. Tomorrow, I was not going to dress like a broken, grieving widower. I was not going to dress like a defeated rail yard worker, waiting for the medical transport team to haul him away to a psychiatric ward. I was going to dress like the true head of this family. I was going to look Preston straight in his cold, arrogant eyes and watch his entire corrupt universe collapse around him. I laid the suit neatly on the edge of the bed. I walked over to the window and looked out at the dark, quiet street. The neighborhood was fast asleep. The streetlights cast long, yellow shadows across the wet pavement. I knew the medical transport team would arrive exactly at 9:00 in the morning, just like Preston had ordered. They would come with their official paperwork and their secure van, expecting to collect a confused elderly man. I had already spoken with Mitchell about how to handle them. We had a specific legal injunction ready to be served the moment they stepped onto my property. They would be sent away empty-handed, and Preston would not know a single thing until it was far too late. I finally lay down on the large empty bed, staring up at the dark ceiling. I listened to the quiet, settling sounds of the old house. The trap was set. The federal authorities were unknowingly standing by. The blind trust was fully operational. Beatrice's final, magnificent piece of corporate warfare was ready to deploy. I closed my eyes and allowed myself a brief, silent prayer of profound gratitude. I thanked God for the 35 beautiful years I had with the smartest, most formidable woman I had ever known. I thanked God for giving me the quiet strength to hold my temper when Preston spat in my face. And I thanked God for the opportunity to save my precious daughter from a lifetime of misery and abuse. Tomorrow the sun would rise over Atlanta. Tomorrow Preston would put on his expensive suit and drive to the downtown law office, dreaming of stolen millions and absolute power. He would sit at the head of the conference table, completely blind to the lethal danger waiting for him in the pages of the will. He would swallow the poison pill with a massive, arrogant smile on his face, and I would be sitting right across from him, watching the venom slowly take hold. I finally drifted into a deep, dreamless sleep, knowing that the righteous vengeance of a devoted father and a brilliant wife was hurtling toward Preston Thorne like a runaway freight train in the dark. The morning of the will reading arrived with a heavy gray sky pressing down on the city of Atlanta. I rode the silent glass elevator up to the 50th floor of the most prestigious law firm in the state. My heavy work boots had been replaced by polished black shoes, and I wore the same dark, tailored suit I had worn to bury my beautiful Beatrice. My heart was beating with a slow, steady rhythm. For 35 years, I had commanded men and machines in the loud, dirty rail yards. I knew how to stand my ground when the earth shook beneath my feet. Today, I was walking into the most important shift of my entire life. The boardroom was a masterpiece of corporate intimidation. It featured massive floor-to-ceiling glass walls that offered a sweeping, panoramic view of the downtown skyline. The city looked small and distant from up here. A massive, polished mahogany table dominated the center of the room, surrounded by high-backed black leather chairs. The air conditioning hummed a soft, freezing tune. I took a seat near the corner, resting my rough, calloused hands flat on the cool wooden surface. I did not look at the expensive artwork on the walls or the crystal water pitchers placed perfectly in the center of the table. I simply focused my mind, locking every single ounce of my fatherly rage inside a tight, mental box. I had a job to do, and I could not afford to let my emotions derail the execution. The heavy glass doors swung open, and Preston marched into the room. He did not simply walk, he paraded. He wore a sharp, light gray designer suit with a silk pocket square that caught the overhead lights. His hair was meticulously styled, and his posture oozed that sickening, arrogant privilege of a man who firmly believed the entire universe owed him a favor. He looked like a conqueror stepping into a defeated city. Right behind him was my precious daughter, Sarah. The contrast between them made my stomach turn completely sick. Sarah walked with her head bowed, her shoulders curled inward, as if she were trying to make herself entirely invisible. She wore a long-sleeved dark green dress, buttoned all the way to her collarbone, intentionally chosen to hide the ugly purple bruises he had left on her fragile arms. She moved with a jerky, nervous hesitation, always keeping one step behind him, like a frightened prisoner of war. Preston did not hold the door for her. He did not check to see if she was all right. He simply pointed a rigid finger at a chair next to his and ordered her to sit. Sarah obeyed instantly, sinking into the leather seat and staring blankly at her folded hands. She did not dare to look across the table at me. Preston ignored my existence completely. He walked straight over to a side table where a heavy crystal decanter of expensive bourbon sat next to a row of polished glasses. At 10 in the morning, he poured himself a generous drink. The ice clinked sharply against the glass, a loud, arrogant sound in the quiet boardroom. He took a long, satisfied sip, letting out a breath of pure entitlement. He unbuttoned his suit jacket and slouched into the large chair at the head of the table, kicking one ankle over his knee. He looked out the massive windows at the city skyline, swirling the amber liquid in his glass, with a smug, victorious smile planted firmly on his face. I watched him with absolute silence. I did not glare. I did not clench my jaw. I sat with the relaxed, motionless posture of a predator, watching a blind animal wander directly into a snare. He thought he had already won. He truly believed his little stunt at my house, throwing those forged medical proxy papers on my kitchen table, had completely broken my spirit. He thought I was just a tired, useless old black man who was terrified of being locked away in a psychiatric ward. He was so completely intoxicated by his own perceived brilliance that he could not see the massive steel jaws of the trap waiting just inches from his ankle. A moment later, the heavy doors opened again, and Harrison, the lead corporate attorney, walked in. He carried a thick leather binder and wore an expression of absolute professional neutrality. Harrison was a shark in a suit, a man who dismantled corporate empires for a living, but today he was playing the role of the humble executor. He took his seat at the opposite end of the mahogany table, opening the thick binder with a quiet rustle of heavy paper. He adjusted his glasses and looked around the room. "Good morning, everyone," Harrison said, his voice crisp and authoritative. "We are here to execute the final testament and living trust of Beatrice. These documents outline the immediate transition of her commercial assets, her retail empire, and her personal estate. As her legal heirs and beneficiaries, you are required to understand the full scope of these provisions before any transfer of power can be officially authorized." Preston took another arrogant sip of his bourbon. "Let us skip the dramatic buildup, Harrison," he said, waving his free hand dismissively. "We all know Beatrice built a massive retail chain. We all know she was a smart woman. But she is gone now, and those stores need sophisticated executive management. I have contractors waiting and investors calling my phone every 5 minutes. Let us just get to the part where I sign the transfer papers so I can get to work and fix the mess she left behind." Hearing him insult my brilliant wife, us life work, hearing him call her magnificent legacy a mess, required every ounce of my willpower to endure. I kept my breathing slow and even. I looked at Sarah. She had squeezed her eyes shut, a single silent tear tracking down her pale cheek. She was bracing herself for the final humiliation. She honestly believed her mother's entire empire was about to be legally handed over to the monster who beat her in the dark. Harrison did not react to Preston's gross disrespect. He simply turned a page in the heavy binder. "Very well, Preston. We will proceed directly to the operational transition clauses." Harrison cleared his throat and began reading the dense legal provisions Beatrice had carefully crafted. He detailed the exact financial standing of the boutique retail chain. He read out the staggering quarterly profits, the real estate valuations of the commercial properties, and the massive liquidity sitting in the corporate holding accounts. With every $1 million, Harrison announced. Preston U.S. smile grew wider and wider. His greedy eyes practically glazed over with pure raw lust. He was salivating at the sheer volume of wealth he thought he was about to control. He leaned forward in his chair, completely captivated by the numbers practically vibrating with greedy anticipation. Then Harrison reached the specific provision we had been waiting for. He paused, taking a slow, deliberate breath. Section 4, Paragraph 2 of the Living Trust dictates the immediate appointment of temporary executive management over all commercial retail assets, Harrison read aloud, his voice echoing perfectly in the quiet glass room. Due to the complex nature of the corporate holdings, the trust requires an individual with demonstrated business acumen to assume temporary signatory authority over the primary operating accounts until the final probate process is concluded. Harrison looked directly at Preston. The trust designates you, Preston, to assume this temporary managerial role, effective immediately upon your signature of the asset transfer consent forms. Preston let out a loud, triumphant bark of laughter. He slammed his empty crystal glass down onto the mahogany table. He looked like a man who had just conquered the entire world. He turned his head and looked directly at me. The malicious, racist superiority burning in his eyes was absolutely sickening. He leaned heavily across the wide mahogany table, resting his weight on his forearms. He stared down at me, his handsome face twisted into an ugly, cruel sneer. He wanted to savor this moment. He wanted to grind my dignity into the dirt in front of my own daughter. "Like I told you at the graveyard," Roland Preston said, his voice dropping into a vicious, mocking whisper. "You are just a useless old man. You spent your whole life sweating in the dirt, playing pretend with a woman who was light years out of your league. You really thought you were going to sit in her big house and spend her millions. You really thought a blue-collar nobody like you could outsmart me." He pointed a manicured finger right at my chest. "I am the future of this family now. I own the businesses. I own the properties. And by tomorrow morning, when my medical transport team arrives at your front door, I will own you too. So do us all a favor and go back to the slums where you belong. You are finished." The air in the boardroom grew completely still. Sarah let out a soft, muffled sob of pure despair, burying her face in her hands. Harrison sat quietly at the end of the table, watching the exchange with cold, professional detachment. I did not break eye contact with Preston. I did not raise my voice. I did not show him a single ounce of the searing, white-hot fury blazing inside my chest. I met his arrogant, malicious gaze with absolute, terrifying silence. I looked at him the way a man looks at a dead insect on the windshield of a moving truck. I let the heavy silence stretch out for 5 agonizing seconds. 10 seconds. 15 seconds. My complete lack of reaction seemed to genuinely unsettle him for a brief, fleeting moment. The cruel smile on his face faltered slightly. He expected me to scream. He expected me to cry or throw a desperate, helpless tantrum. My absolute stony silence unnerved his massive ego, but his overwhelming greed quickly swallowed his brief moment of doubt. He scoffed, shaking his head in mock pity, and turned his attention back to the lawyer. "Give me the damn pen," Harrison Preston demanded, snapping his fingers impatiently. "Give me the transfer documents. I have better things to do today than babysit a broken old man." Harrison did not speak. He simply reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a single crisp document printed on thick ivory paper. He slid the document across the polished mahogany table along with a heavy silver fountain pen. The paper came to a smooth stop right in front of Preston. "This is the temporary asset transfer consent form," Harrison stated, his voice completely devoid of any emotion. "By signing this document, you formally accept the responsibilities and the binding legal conditions set forth in Beatrice U.S. Living Trust. You must sign your full legal name on the bottom line." Preston did not even bother to read the text on the page. His hubris was so monumental, so completely blinding, that he did not even scan the legal jargon. He snatched the silver pen from the table with eager, trembling hands. He was practically panting with greed. He saw nothing but endless wealth and absolute power waiting for him on that dotted line. He did not know that the paper he was staring at was the activation switch for the poison pill. He did not know that by signing his name he was officially triggering a total and irrevocable forfeiture of his entire inheritance. He did not realize he was actively consenting to a massive federal audit of his fraudulent offshore accounts. I sat perfectly still, watching his hand move. I watched him press the silver nib of the pen against the thick ivory paper. He signed his first name with a grand, sweeping flourish. He signed his last name with aggressive, arrogant force. He threw the pen down onto the table with a loud clatter. "There," he said, letting out a deep breath of absolute satisfaction. "It is done. The empire is mine." He leaned back in his black leather chair, crossing his arms over his chest, completely oblivious to the fact that he had just signed his own financial and legal death warrant. He looked at me, expecting to finally see the absolute defeat in my eyes. But I just sat there, staring back at him, waiting for the devastating reality of his massive, fatal mistake to completely destroy his world. The ink from Preston's heavy silver fountain pen had barely dried on the thick ivory paper before the atmosphere in the massive glass-walled boardroom began to physically shift. He pushed the document across the polished mahogany table with a flick of his wrist, leaning back in his luxurious black leather chair, like a conquering king who had just secured his new kingdom. He crossed his arms over his tailored chest, completely satisfied with his own perceived brilliance. I watched him breathe in the cool air of the room, completely oblivious to the fact that the oxygen was about to be sucked right out of his lungs. I kept my heavy, calloused hands folded neatly on my lap. I did not flinch. I did not say a single word. I let him enjoy his absolute peak of arrogance because I knew the fall from that towering height was going to break every single bone in his monstrous ego. Harrison, the lead corporate attorney, carefully collected the signed document. He did not smile. He did not offer any warm congratulations. He handled the paper with the sterile precision of a coroner inspecting a highly toxic specimen. He placed it securely inside a thick black folder and closed the cover with a sharp, decisive snap. That sound echoed across the long room like the racking of a shotgun slide. Mitchell, sitting right beside me, remained as still as a carved stone statue. His sharp gray eyes were locked firmly onto Preston, watching the younger man with the cold calculation of a veteran judge preparing to deliver a brutal maximum sentence. Preston completely ignored the heavy silence settling over the room. He reached over to the crystal decanter and poured himself another generous splash of expensive bourbon, the glass clinking loudly and obnoxiously in the quiet space. He was ready to leave. He was ready to strut out of that downtown skyscraper and take total, absolute control of my late wife's magnificent retail empire. But Harrison did not stand up to dismiss the meeting. Instead, The attorney reached deep into his heavy leather briefcase. He pulled out something that instantly changed the entire gravity of the room. It was a thick manila envelope sealed tightly with dark red wax. The heavy wax bore the distinct custom stamp of Beatrice Aujas' personal notary. Preston paused, his glass hovering just an inch from his smug lips. His perfectly groomed eyebrows pulled together in a slight confused frown. He looked at the bright red wax seal and then back at the lawyer. He asked what that envelope was, his voice losing a tiny fraction of its polished, arrogant edge. He demanded that Harrison stop wasting his valuable time claiming he had important contractors waiting for him downtown to begin the corporate transition. Harrison adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses, completely ignoring the disrespectful outburst. He placed his hands flat on the mahogany table and looked directly into Preston U.S. eyes. The attorney stated in a voice absolutely devoid of any human warmth that the asset transfer Preston had just eagerly signed was merely the preliminary step. He announced that the reading of the will was not yet concluded. Harrison explained that Beatrice had left explicit, irrevocable instructions that this specific sealed envelope was to be opened and executed immediately after the primary beneficiary agreements were signed. Harrison broke the red wax seal. The sharp cracking sound was the loudest thing in the entire world. He reached inside the envelope and pulled out a single sheet of heavy premium parchment paper. He announced to the room, his voice dropping into a solemn, resonant tone, that we were now moving to the final clause. He made it incredibly clear that this specific clause went into effect immediately, and that it was completely and totally unconditional. Preston slowly lowered his crystal glass to the table. His arrogant, relaxed posture began to stiffen. I watched his eyes dart toward Mitchell, and then toward me, desperately trying to find a crack in our armor or some sign of weakness. He found absolutely nothing but cold, unyielding resolve. Sarah, sitting quietly next to him, completely froze. She held her breath, as if her instincts sensed the massive tidal wave approaching the shore. Harrison began to read. Beatrice U.S. powerful words filled the room, perfectly translated through the lawyer U.S. clinical, devastating delivery. The document detailed a specific ironclad provision regarding fiduciary duty and familial integrity. Harrison read that any heir or legal representative proven to have committed financial abuse against the estate, or any member of the immediate family, would instantly forfeit all rights, privileges, and inheritances. Preston scoffed loudly, rolling his eyes in exaggerated disbelief. He interrupted the lawyer, claiming this was just standard boilerplate legal trash. He demanded to know why we were wasting time reading generic warning clauses. Harrison did not look up from the paper. He simply turned the page and continued reading. But the words that came out of his mouth next completely drained the warm, healthy color from Preston O.'s face. Harrison began reading off a highly specific, deeply hidden list of private banking details. He read the exact international routing numbers of the offshore accounts located in the Cayman Islands. He read the specific corporate names of the 3 phantom contracting companies Preston had secretly created to siphon money away from Beatrice U.S. retail stores. He read the exact dates and the precise dollar amounts of the fraudulent commercial loans Preston had taken out using my daughter Sarah U.S. stolen identity. $300,000 in toxic illegal debt was meticulously documented and laid completely bare in the middle of that pristine boardroom. Preston's mouth fell open. He tried to speak, but absolutely no sound came out of his throat. The healthy tan color of his skin turned into a sickly, terrifying shade of pale gray. His eyes widened in sheer, unfiltered terror. He looked like an arrogant man who had just confidently stepped off a high cliff and finally realized there was absolutely no ground beneath his expensive shoes. Harrison did not stop. He was a flawless machine delivering absolute legal annihilation. The lawyer read the forensic evidence, proving beyond any shadow of a doubt that Preston had actively forged Beatrice's U.S. signature on major financial documents while she was physically fighting terminal cancer in a hospice bed. He laid out the entire chronological timeline of the financial abuse, detailing every single stolen penny. Therefore, Harrison concluded, finally looking up from the parchment paper and staring directly into Preston's U.S.-wide terrified eyes. Due to the overwhelming and irrefutable breach of fiduciary duty, your temporary managerial status over the retail assets is permanently revoked. Your entire stake in the inheritance is completely and irrevocably liquidated. You are officially stripped of all assets, properties, and corporate authority associated with this estate. You get absolutely nothing. The silence that followed that devastating declaration was heavy enough to crush solid diamonds. Preston sat completely frozen in his chair, his chest heaving rapidly as he tried to process the sheer magnitude of his absolute destruction. His perfectly styled hair seemed to lose its form. He shook his head frantically side to side. He stammered that this was a trick, a massive illegal setup. His voice cracked, pitching upward into a state of raw, humiliating panic. He pointed a trembling finger at the black folder on the table. He shouted that he had just signed the asset transfer. He insisted that he was the legal manager, and that we had all just watched him sign the binding consent forms, giving him total power. Harrison leaned forward, folding his hands neatly together on the polished granite table. A cold, razor-sharp smile finally touched the experienced lawyer's lips. He looked at the broken man sitting across from him with pure professional satisfaction. Harrison told Preston that he was absolutely right. He confirmed that Preston had indeed signed the consent forms eagerly and without hesitation. But then Harrison delivered the ultimate fatal blow. He explained that Preston had been so completely blinded by his own overwhelming greed and massive superiority complex that he failed to actually read the legal document placed directly in front of him. Preston looked down at the thick black folder sitting near Harrison's U.S. hands. His breathing became incredibly ragged, sounding like a man suffocating on his own panic. He demanded to know exactly what he had signed. His voice shook with absolute terror as he asked what the hell the lawyer had just made him do. Mitchell was the one who finally answered. The retired state judge leaned forward, his silver hair catching the bright overhead lights. His voice boomed through the glass room, carrying the absolute righteous authority of a man who had spent his life locking away dangerous criminals. Mitchell looked at his former golden boy with pure, unadulterated disgust. "You did not sign an asset transfer." Preston Mitchell stated his words, striking like heavy iron hammers. "You just signed a legally binding federal consent form. You just granted federal investigators full, unrestricted access to your personal and corporate bank accounts. You just voluntarily waived your right to any financial privacy." I watched the exact moment Preston's entire corrupt universe shattered into a million unrecoverable pieces. The horrific realization of what he had actually done hit him with the devastating force of a speeding freight train. He had not just lost the millions of dollars he thought he was brilliantly stealing. He had legally and willingly invited the Federal Bureau of Investigation directly into the very center of his criminal life. Mitchell explained coldly that the blind trust was already sealing the estate assets. He informed Preston that the federal authorities were already moving in on his fraudulent offshore accounts at this very second. Preston was completely and utterly trapped. There was no clever legal maneuver he could deploy. There was no expensive defense lawyer who could save him. There was no wealthy country club friend who could rescue him from a massive federal indictment, especially when his own arrogant signature was sitting at the bottom of the voluntary consent form. The heavy crystal bourbon glass slipped right out of Preston U.S. trembling, sweaty hand. It hit the hard edge of the polished mahogany table and plummeted directly toward the floor. The glass shattered violently against the expensive hardwood, sending a shower of sharp crystal fragments and amber liquid flying across the room. The loud crashing sound echoed through the quiet boardroom, marking the absolute definitive end of his reign of terror. I sat in my leather chair, completely still, watching the broken pieces of glass settle on the wet floor. I looked over at my beautiful daughter. For the first time in years, Sarah lifted her head and looked at her husband. She did not look at him with the paralyzing fear that had controlled her life for so long. She looked at him with a sudden blooming realization that the monster holding her captive was finally bleeding out. The invincible giant she had been terrified of was nothing but a pathetic, cowardly thief caught in a trap built by a smarter, braver woman. Preston tried to stand up, but his knees buckled slightly. He grabbed the edge of the table, trying to hold himself upright. He looked at me, his eyes pleading, begging for some sort of mercy he had never once shown my family. He opened his mouth to speak, to try and bargain his way out of the federal prison cell waiting for him. But I simply stood up from my chair, buttoned my dark suit jacket, and looked down at the broken, shattered glass at his feet. "You told me to go back to the slums," I said, my voice low, rumbling, and completely steady. "But it looks like you are the one who is going to be looking for a new place to live. And where you are going, they do not serve expensive bourbon." I turned my back on him, completely dismissing his ruined existence. I walked over to Sarah, extending my large, calloused hand toward her. She looked up at me, a beautiful, genuine smile finally breaking through her tears. She took my hand, standing up tall, and walking out of that glass room, leaving her nightmare completely behind. The trap had snapped shut, and the train was moving forward, leaving the wreckage exactly where it belonged. If my story connected with you, please leave a like to bring a little sunshine to this old Father Us heart. Subscribe to the channel so you do not miss my next life stories. Tell me in the comments where you are watching this video from, and what time it is there right now. It makes me really happy to know which corner of the country or the world is listening to me, and what time of day it is for you. Always remember that real strength does not always roar. Sometimes it waits patiently in the dark until the time is exactly right to strike. Keep your eyes open, keep your heart strong, and protect the people you love. See you in the next life story with love and respect. The sharp, explosive sound of the heavy crystal bourbon glass shattering against the polished hardwood floor echoed through the massive boardroom like a sudden crack of thunder. The expensive amber liquid splashed across the pristine wood, pooling around Preston U.S. Custom Italian leather shoes. For a long, agonizing moment, nobody in the glass-walled room moved a single muscle. The heavy silence that followed was so incredibly thick and suffocating that I could actually hear the quiet, rhythmic ticking of the expensive silver clock resting on the mahogany table. I remained perfectly seated in my high-backed leather chair, keeping my broad shoulders completely relaxed and my breathing slow and measured. For 35 years, I managed the loud, chaotic, and highly dangerous environment of the Georgia freight yards. I knew exactly how to stand my ground when the massive steel engines screamed and the ground shook violently beneath my heavy work boots. I knew that true, absolute power did not require shouting or frantic movement. True power was simply watching an arrogant, destructive man completely dismantle his own life with a single, careless signature. Preston stood entirely frozen, staring down at the broken shards of crystal glittering in the spilled alcohol. The arrogant, victorious smirk that had dominated his handsome face just a few moments ago had completely vanished, washed away by a sudden, sickening wave of pure, unfiltered panic. The healthy, confident color rapidly drained from his cheeks, leaving his skin looking like pale gray ash. He looked at his own right hand, the hand that had just eagerly gripped the silver fountain pen, and signed the federal consent form, as if it had suddenly transformed into a venomous snake. His chest began to heave with short, shallow breaths. His mind, usually so incredibly quick to manufacture a slick lie or a convenient excuse, was completely short-circuiting under the crushing weight of reality. He slowly lifted his head and looked across the wide mahogany table at Harrison. His eyes were wide and bloodshot, darting frantically back and forth. He opened his mouth to speak, but his throat was so dry that absolutely no sound came out. He swallowed hard, licking his pale lips, and tried again. His voice, when it finally emerged, was nothing but a fragile, broken whisper. He told the corporate attorney that there had been a terrible misunderstanding. He claimed that he had been under extreme emotional distress and that he had not properly reviewed the legal documentation. He demanded that Harrison immediately open the black leather briefcase and tear up the signed consent form. He insisted that the signature was entirely invalid and that he was formally revoking his legal consent. Harrison did not even blink. The veteran corporate litigator simply adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and rested his hands flat on the polished granite surface of the table. Harrison looked at Preston with the cold, clinical detachment of a surgeon examining a cadaver. He informed Preston in a perfectly level, monotone voice that a federal consent form signed voluntarily, in the presence of legal counsel and a retired state judge, was absolutely irrevocable the second the ink bonded with the paper. He explained that the encrypted digital copies of the document had already been automatically transmitted to the federal authorities the moment the black folder was closed. There was no reversing the process. The legal mechanism was already fully operational. The sheer terrifying finality of Harrison U.S. words finally pierced through Preston U.S. thick armor of delusion. His desperate panic instantly curdled into a violent, explosive anger. His face flushed bright red, and the veins in his neck bulged against his expensive silk collar. He slammed his fists down onto the mahogany table, rattling the crystal water pitchers. He began to shout, his voice echoing harshly off the floor to ceiling glass windows. He threatened to sue the entire law firm. He threatened to entirely destroy Harrison U.S. professional career. He screamed that he was a wealthy, powerful man with elite connections and that nobody in this city had the right to treat him like a common criminal. He puffed out his chest, trying to reclaim the intimidating corporate dominance he had relied on his entire life. I looked over at my beautiful daughter. Sarah was sitting perfectly still in her leather chair, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Just an hour ago, she had walked into this building, looking like a terrified prisoner of war, shrinking away from her husband, us cruel shadow. But now she was watching him unravel with a quiet, profound sense of awakening. She was finally seeing the absolute truth. The invincible, untouchable giant she had feared for so many grueling years was nothing but a pathetic, weak coward hiding behind a tailored suit and a stolen bank account. The monster who had bruised her fragile arms and crushed her spirit was currently throwing a helpless, frantic tantrum in the middle of a corporate boardroom. A deep, powerful wave of fatherly vindication washed over my heavy heart. I had promised my dying wife that I would protect our little girl, and I was finally keeping that sacred promise. Before Preston could hurl another empty, desperate threat across the table, the heavy double doors of the boardroom swung open with tremendous, commanding force. Mitchell, who had been standing quietly near the back wall, stepped forward to hold the heavy oak door open. The retired state judge looked at his former golden boy with an expression of pure, absolute disgust. Flanking Mitchell as they stepped into the quiet room were two incredibly tall, broad-shouldered men. They wore dark, nondescript suits and possessed a hardened, strictly professional demeanor that instantly commanded absolute obedience. Clipped securely to their leather belts were the unmistakable shining gold shields of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The lead agent, a man with close-cropped steel-gray hair and eyes as cold as winter ice, stepped confidently onto the plush carpet. He did not ask for permission to enter, and he did not wait for an introduction. He called out Preston's full legal name, his deep voice cutting through the tense air like a heavy steel blade. The agent announced that they were executing active federal warrants for his immediate arrest. He pulled a thick folded document from his jacket pocket and began reading the devastating list of criminal charges. Every single word the federal agent spoke landed like a brutal physical blow against Preston's U.S. collapsing reality. The agent listed multiple counts of felony wire fraud related to the offshore accounts hidden in the Cayman Islands. He listed aggravated corporate forgery regarding the fraudulent commercial loans taken out under Sarah U.S. stolen identity. He listed severe financial elder abuse connected directly to the forged medical proxy Preston had intended to use against me. The agent then delivered the ultimate crushing detail. He calmly informed Preston that the Federal Cyber Division was currently executing simultaneous raids on his phantom contracting companies, and that every single bank account associated with his name had already been permanently frozen. Preston backed away from the table, his expensive Italian shoes slipping dangerously on the spilled bourbon and shattered crystal glass covering the floor. The last remaining shreds of his elite, untouchable facade completely and totally disintegrated right in front of my eyes. The arrogant, wealthy broker, the man who thought he could casually steal my wife, whose magnificent legacy and lock me away in a psychiatric ward simply ceased to exist. His knees violently buckled beneath his weight. He could no longer support the sheer crushing magnitude of his own destruction. Preston collapsed heavily onto the floor right in the middle of the opulent boardroom. He did not fall with any sort of grace or dignity. He dropped like a massive, heavy stone, and then he began to weep. It was a loud, ugly, hyperventilating sound of absolute, unfiltered terror. He scrambled across the expensive rug, his hands grasping frantically at the air, and threw his entire body directly at my feet. He grabbed the fabric of my dark suit trousers, his sweaty, trembling fingers digging desperately into my leg. He looked up at me, his face entirely streaked with tears and running sweat. His perfectly styled hair had fallen wildly across his forehead, masking his bloodshot, panicked eyes. He looked exactly like a cornered, desperate animal begging for a trap to be opened. "Roland, please," Preston sobbed, his voice completely cracking into a high, pathetic whine that echoed off the glass walls. "Please, you have to stop them. You have to tell the agents it was all a terrible mistake. I will give every single penny back. I will drain the offshore accounts today. I will pay back the loans with my own money. I will leave the state and I will never ever speak to Sarah again. Just please do not let them lock me away in a federal cell. I cannot survive in a place like that. Look at me, Roland. I am begging you on my hands and knees. You are a good Christian man. You are a forgiving man. Make a deal with them. Please show me some mercy." He pulled frantically at my pants, his chest heaving with violent, ragged sobs. He had completely abandoned any remaining shred of human pride. He was actively groveling in his own spilled liquor, pleading for his freedom from the very man he had so casually referred to as an ignorant, useless old nobody just 10 minutes prior. I looked down at the weeping, trembling coward gripping my leg. I felt the comforting, loving presence of my daughter sitting safely nearby. I felt the immense, powerful, unyielding spirit of my late wife Beatrice filling the large room, standing right beside me in this final moment of absolute victory. I searched my heart, and I searched my soul, and I found absolutely not one single ounce of pity. I did not feel any sudden merciful urge to forgive a man who had shown zero mercy to the people I loved more than my own life. I reached down with my large, heavy hands and firmly pried his sweaty, trembling fingers off my dark trousers. I stood up tall from my leather chair, straightening my suit jacket, and pulling my broad shoulders back. I stepped forward, allowing my large frame to completely block out the natural light pouring in from the massive windows, casting a long, dark shadow directly over his weeping face. I looked down into his terrified, broken eyes. My voice was incredibly low, rumbling deep inside my chest, and echoing with the quiet, absolute authority of a father who had just fought and won a brutal war to save his family from complete ruin. "You truly thought you were dealing with a stupid, broken old man," I said, my words dropping into the quiet room with cold, measured finality. "You thought my life of hard physical labor made me weak and ignorant. You thought your expensive suits and your country club friends made you an untouchable king. But you forgot one very important thing, Preston. A rail yard worker knows exactly how to switch the heavy steel tracks to send a runaway train straight into a solid brick wall. You built this destructive train yourself, and you drove it right into the concrete. Never ever touch my daughter again." I gave a short, sharp nod to the waiting federal agents. They stepped forward immediately, grabbing Preston roughly by his tailored arms and hauling his dead weight forcefully to his feet. They pulled his trembling hands sharply behind his back, and the heavy metal handcuffs clicked loudly and securely around his wrists. The sound was sharp and permanent. Preston continued to sob hysterically, his head hanging down in total, utter humiliation, as the agents marched him quickly out of the glass boardroom and down the long, quiet hallway, removing his vile, toxic poison from our lives forever. I stood in the sudden quiet of the room, listening to his pathetic cries slowly fade away into the distance. Mitchell walked over and placed a firm, respectful hand on my shoulder, a silent acknowledgement of a battle perfectly executed. I turned around and looked at Sarah. She was standing up, her tears finally drying her posture straight and proud. I walked over and wrapped my heavy arms around her, holding my precious little girl tightly against my chest, knowing that the dark, terrifying storm had finally passed, and the bright morning sun was waiting for us outside. The heavy mahogany doors clicked shut behind the federal agents, taking the last pathetic remnants of the nightmare out of our lives completely and forever. The luxurious, glass-walled boardroom was entirely silent, except for the soft mechanical hum of the central air conditioning, pumping cool air through the massive, high-rise building. The sharp, bitter scent of spilled, expensive bourbon drifted up from the shattered crystal resting on the polished hardwood floor. It was the distinct smell of broken arrogance and absolute ruin. I kept my broad shoulders squared, my breathing slow and incredibly steady, refusing to let the massive adrenaline spike compromise my calm demeanor. I turned my attention away from the empty space where a monster had just been thoroughly dismantled and looked entirely at my daughter. Sarah was standing near her heavy leather chair, her hands resting lightly on the smooth backrest. For the very first time in agonizing years, she was not physically shrinking into herself, trying to be completely invisible. She took a deep, ragged breath, pulling the clean, cool air deep into her lungs, as if she were truly tasting oxygen for the very first time in her adult life. Her beautiful eyes, still red from the overwhelming stress and absolute terror of the morning, were now incredibly wide and vividly clear. The thick, heavy, invisible chains that Preston had violently wrapped around her gentle spirit had been completely and totally shattered into a million unrecoverable pieces. She took one tentative step toward me, then another, and finally she rushed across the expensive corporate carpet and collapsed directly into my arms. I wrapped my large, heavy hands around her fragile shoulders, pulling her tight against my solid chest. She buried her face deep into the fabric of my dark suit jacket, letting out a long, exhausted sigh that carried years of hidden, brutal pain far away. I held my little girl, feeling the delicate bones of her spine shaking with absolute, undeniable relief. I closed my eyes, resting my chin gently on the top of her head. I told her in a low, comforting rumble that it was completely over. I promised her with every ounce of my soul that he would never ever cast a dark, terrifying shadow over her beautiful life again. She wept quietly against my chest, but these were no longer the frantic, terrified tears of a trapped, helpless victim. These were the gentle, warm, cleansing tears of a strong woman who had just survived a massive, brutal storm and found herself standing safely on solid, dry land. We stood there, in the middle of that towering Atlanta skyscraper, holding tightly onto each other, anchoring our broken family back together. I knew Beatrice was watching us from somewhere high above, smiling that brilliant, knowing, magnificent smile of hers, absolutely proud of the flawless trap we had successfully sprung. Harrison, the sharp corporate attorney, quietly gathered his thick blue binders, sensing the profound emotional weight filling the expansive room. He gave me a silent, deeply respectful nod and slipped out the side door, giving us complete, absolute privacy. Only Mitchell remained. The retired state judge stood near the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out over the sprawling city skyline as the morning gray clouds finally began to separate and let the bright sunlight through. For 35 long years, this wealthy, educated man had viewed me through a thick, cloudy lens of upper-class prejudice. He had seen my faded denim work jackets, my heavy scuffed boots, and the dark industrial grease permanently stained into the deep creases of my hands. He had always assumed I was a simple, uneducated physical laborer who was entirely unworthy of his brilliant, sophisticated sister. But today, the massive, impenetrable walls of his elite worldview had been completely and violently torn down. Mitchell turned away from the bright glass windows and walked slowly toward the center of the room. He looked down at the puddle of spilled liquor and the sharp, broken glass resting near the edge of the mahogany table. Then he looked up and met my dark, steady gaze. He did not look at me with the polite, cold condescension I had quietly endured at decades of awkward, uncomfortable family holiday dinners. He looked at me with a raw, profound, and deeply humbling respect. Mitchell stepped forward, smoothing his tailored suit jacket, and extended his right hand. I gently released Sarah, letting her stand proudly on her own 2 feet, and I reached out to meet his grip. We shook hands firmly, 2 older men from 2 entirely different universes, who had just fought side by side in the most important, critical battle of our lives. Mitchell spoke my name, his voice thick with a genuine, sincere emotion I had never once heard him use before. He told me that he owed me the deepest and most profound apology a man could possibly give to another human being. For over 3 decades, he confessed he had looked down on my working-class background. He judged my blue-collar life and arrogantly assumed he knew exactly what kind of man I was. He admitted he thought his expensive education and his generational wealth made him a vastly superior protector of our family. He called himself a completely blind fool. Mitchell kept his firm grip on my hand, looking deeply into my eyes. He told me that I saw the brutal, horrific truth when all of them were thoroughly blinded by a charming smile and an expensive designer suit. He said I did not just save Beatrice U.S. legacy today, but that I had literally saved his niece us life. He acknowledged me as the true, authentic, and fearless protector of this family. He finished his apology by stating he would be deeply honored if I would finally allow him to call me his brother. I looked into his sharp gray eyes and saw the absolute, unvarnished sincerity radiating from his very soul. I gave his hand one final heavy squeeze. I told him that family is defined entirely by the desperate battles we are willing to fight for each other, and that today we had stood shoulder to shoulder on the exact same side of the war. The heavy, bitter racial and class tension that had quietly divided us for 35 long years instantly evaporated into the conditioned air, leaving behind a deep, permanent foundation of mutual respect and unbreakable loyalty. The busy, productive months that followed that explosive morning in the downtown boardroom were completely dedicated to absolute healing and rigorous structural rebuilding. We did not just want Sarah to survive her traumatic past, we wanted her to completely and totally dominate her bright future. Preston was denied bail by a highly unsympathetic federal judge and locked away in a secure holding facility, awaiting a massive, highly publicized criminal trial. His elite country club friends and powerful political connections instantly abandoned him, treating his very name like a highly contagious, deadly disease. The Federal Cyber Division completely dismantled his complex offshore banking network, recovering every single stolen penny and routing it directly back into Beatrice U.S. secure corporate estate. But recovering the stolen retail money was only the preliminary step in my master plan. I sat down with Harrison and Mitchell for countless hours to perfectly execute the comprehensive blind trust I had established. We methodically untangled Sarah O's ruined financial identity from Preston U.S. toxic, fraudulent commercial loans. Armed with the irrefutable forensic evidence provided directly by the federal investigation, we forced the massive commercial banks to completely erase the $300,000 of illegal debt from her name, entirely clearing her public credit and restoring her pristine financial standing. I wanted to make absolutely certain that my daughter would never again be vulnerable to the treacherous control of another greedy human being. We transferred a massive portion of the recovered retail assets directly into a secure, independent trust, solely under Sarah U.S. complete, unyielding control. I spent hours sitting with her at my quiet kitchen table, teaching her the fierce, meticulous corporate strategies her mother had used to build her retail empire from scratch. I taught her how to carefully read complex financial statements, how to quickly identify predatory banking contracts, and how to command a room full of wealthy executives with absolute fearless authority. As the warm Georgia spring slowly melted into a bright, vibrant, humid summer, the physical and emotional bruises completely faded from Sarah's beautiful life. She began wearing lovely short-sleeved dresses again, her delicate arms completely free of any dark, violent marks. She gained back her healthy, natural weight, and the hollow, frightened shadows beneath her eyes were entirely replaced by a fierce, radiant, and unstoppable confidence. She boldly stepped into the primary executive role of Beatrice U.S. boutique retail chain, commanding the massive corporate operations with a brilliant, sharp mind that would have made her mother cry tears of absolute supreme joy. She was no longer a terrified hostage trapped in a gilded, suffocating cage. She was a powerful, independent, wealthy woman who relied on absolutely nobody, us money, but her own. She had walked barefoot through the deepest, darkest valleys of betrayal and abuse, and emerged perfectly forged in solid, indestructible steel. I look back on that long, desperate, terrifying journey, and I realize that life has a very specific, profound way of testing the absolute outer limits of a man's enduring soul. I spent 35 grueling years of my life managing the loud, dangerous, highly combustible chaos of the railroad tracks, firmly believing that physical strength and muscular endurance were the only true valid measures of a man's worth. I honestly thought moving thousands of tons of heavy steel freight through the freezing rain was the hardest labor I would ever face in my time on this earth. But absolutely nothing prepares a loving father for the sheer, terrifying, visceral agony of watching his only child suffer silently in the dark shadows of a bad marriage. Nothing prepares your heart for the deep, burning, primitive rage that violently threatens to consume your rational mind when a smooth-talking, wealthy coward tries to steal your family's hard-earned legacy and legally lock you away in a dark, padded hospital room. It takes a monumental amount of discipline to look evil directly in the face and smile back. But I learned a profound and beautiful lesson standing in the quiet darkness of my basement, holding my late wife Yuzet's brilliant secret files waiting for the perfect moment to strike. I learned that you must never let anyone else's arrogance make you feel small. Family is protected not just with your heart, but with a sharp mind. Those who try to steal the sweat and tears of honest people will eventually reap nothing but darkness. A rail yard worker knows how to switch the tracks to send a runaway train straight into a brick wall. Never let a predator convince you that they hold all the absolute power just because they wear a more expensive suit or speak with a smoother vocabulary. True, authentic power lives entirely in the quiet, patient, absolute determination to do exactly what is right for the people you love. You do not have to shout at the top of your lungs to be clearly heard, and you certainly do not have to throw a violent physical punch to completely and utterly dismantle a dangerous enemy. You simply have to stand your ground, hold fiercely onto your personal dignity, and patiently let the crushing, immense weight of their own monumental hubris bring them directly to their knees. If my story brought a little sunshine and justice to your day, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel to support this old man. And tell me in the comments, which city or state are you watching from, and what time is it there right now? If you have ever had to stand your ground against someone who thought they were better than you, share your experience below. Your company means the world to me. See you in the next life story. With love and respect.